Piano Hour Performance, Music Revival Online, our sequence of live stream presentations, which have been taking place since March. As I said, this is number 42 in our process, and we have a very exciting and very unusual program for you. We will be starting at 6 p.m. If you'd like to make yourselves comfortable, find yourself a comfortable place to be. If you are watching this live, we hope you are watching this live. If you're not, we will be starting the program in about 6 or 7 minutes. This evening's presentation, this evening's program, I'm going to be doing a discussion. There's going to be quite a lot of talking. I know it's always interesting to see the relationship between the talking content and the playing content of the programs. Obviously, I do try to keep the music the main focus and the playing content the bulk of the presentation. But this evening's program, I'm going to do something a little bit different, and I have put together a presentation called What Are We Listening To?, which is really a selection of background details. I have looked at my own presentations, which I've been talking to you about for a number of weeks and for quite some time. And I realize I talk about many details about keys and pieces of music and composers and the sort of sporadic mentions of a C major in a romantic 19th century period of this composer and a sonata and that, and it's opus something this and it's K number that. And I thought, well, actually the sensible thing to do, I think the right thing to do here, is to actually try and give an overview instead of trying to actually just have little snapshots and moments here and there and expect everyone to follow along. I'm sure there are many of you who would appreciate having an overview of everything, of how all of this fits together, of all the possibilities in one selection, and for me to try and explain what I am actually talking about when we're talking about these concepts. So if you are a music aficionado and a fundi, and this might not be of interest to you, hopefully it will, because I'm sure there'll be something interesting, some interesting details to come up. But if you are just interested and want to know more about the music that I'm playing, or trying to contextualize or have a better oversight about the number of details that I include in my programs over the last few months, in fact, then this is going to be for you. So join us in a few minutes, and hope you are going to benefit and enjoy the selection as well as the music that I'll be playing in it. I'll be doing a lot of talking and playing. First of all, the equipment. As you can see, we've had a few issues the week before, not so much last week, but the week before, about syncing issues, as well as rather one unfortunate live session where we, in fact, had a complete reversal of the cameras. It wasn't the camera, it was just something that the one computer decided to do, and it reversed the entire image. So everything was going backwards, and I was told not to play the music backwards. And that wasn't going to work. And you can see now, I think the camera angles are working out pretty well. Everything's coming very nicely. And we have beautiful cameras, we have beautiful lighting. And then last Wednesday, we had an issue where there were some problems with syncing as well. And that's all coming out beautifully. It seems like our sound sync has been fixed. There's so many elements, not only the equipment itself having to talk to each other, but also the various programs, the software, and the platforms which they are streamed on and how they might fit together. And we found a solution. We found a very interesting software setup that works beautifully with the Vimeo platform, which I'm streaming from. And as I've kept saying, but the one thing about Vimeo, which is really fantastic, is that it allows us to stream simultaneously, not only to the my Vimeo channel, also at the same time to my channel on YouTube. It allows me to embed that into my website, which I think some of you might be watching there. And it also allows me to embed that or to broadcast simultaneously to as many Facebook pages as I want, which is such great fun. So it means that whichever page and whichever possibility you are watching from, you can enjoy it. The great thing about the Facebook option, as I've always said, is that it's very interesting for people to be able to comment, talk to each other, and develop a sense of community. And I do gather that, I see that there's a sense of community of regular watchers on the various pages. not only on my private page, but also Christopher Duggan Pianist, Music Revival KZN and the Cape Classic Music Festival, as well as the Tatham Art Gallery, and occasionally the music school in Massanet in Spain. Join us for that as well. And it's interesting to see how the comments flow back and forward, and everyone is supporting each other, and most importantly, supporting me. I was very encouraged by the support and the understanding and the enthusiasm and the encouragement to please don't stop, to please carry on. Both Kevin and I, Kevin Liddell, who's handling the technical side, running the show, has also been working incredibly hard trying to make this all work. It's a learning experience for all of us involved to get all these platforms and programs, software and platforms to talk together correctly. So thank you for all your support, and of course thank you to everyone who has been donating, and especially to 3 donors who have been very generous with substantial donations to help us towards this equipment. We have obviously incurred an enormous cost to make it happen, as well as ongoing costs. So if you are able to support us either with equipment or the ongoing running costs, or just in fact the opportunity to for me to keep on doing these things and bringing them free to a number of people, please do support us. We do have a Quicket platform and a QR code, which I think Kevin might be able to show you in a minute. We're trying out a new platform for sharing the graphics with you this evening, which means that the Quicket code is going to be enormous. Apologies for that. We'd like to have it just appear very subtly here and there in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen, but tonight it's going to be large. So please, if you look at it now and you'd like to take a snapshot of it or point your camera at it on your laptop or your phone, your smart TV, at least with your phone, it should take you directly to the site, or you will find all the links to all of those options at my website, musicrevival.co.za. Gosh, I'm feeling quite anxious this evening. Oh, yes, I'm feeling very anxious. I forgot in the run-up. So we moved the session from Thursday to Wednesday to avoid load shedding. And then I discovered today that, in fact, load shedding should have been taking place right now. Load shedding was due to take place from 4 to 6 p.m. So actually, as I'm watching the clock count down until 6 p.m., if there's some weird setup that these sessions have shifted and we are now in a different zone, the load shedding will probably start now or within a few seconds. So if I disappear, you'll understand what has happened. There's very little we can do about that. It is now 6 p.m. and I really hope that we haven't been moved around in our zone for load shedding. So I'm going to carry on regardless. Let's just see what happens. Good evening to everyone, and welcome again. It's Christopher Duggan coming to you from our home in Pietermaritzburg. It is now 6 p.m. On with our Piano Hour production this evening. As I said, I am going to be doing a unique, quite different presentation involving a lot of discussion, lots of playing in between. But this is going to be a presentation that I've put together called What Are We Listening To? I'm aiming to give you an introduction into various concepts and ideas about the various terms, figures and ideas that I always discuss in my concerts, and hopefully you'll be able to refer back to this as many times as you want to as well, if you'd like to learn more about it. It is 1 minute past 6 and off we go. So, the important thing about sound, and all sound in general, is that it is created by vibrations, and there are waves of sound which are measured in hertz. Hertz is what is used to the, what is the word I'm looking for? The unit of measurement for vibrations of sound. And in approximately the year of 1713, a Frenchman by the name of Joseph Sauveur decided that, Sauveur at least, decided that in fact there should be a unified level of sound according to the number of notes and according to the number of hertz, because various orchestras and various musicians might travel around and they would say, okay, well, we're going to tune to the note A. And then a musician from another country might have come, or another region, or another town, and said, but that's not the same note A that I've got. It's all but different. I've got a different note. And so Joseph Sauveur decided that there should be a standardized method, and that one particular pitch or one particular wavelength should be donated. as the note, and that is what we work with. We work today generally with a sequence of notes where the note A, which is here on the piano, is 440 hertz. It's known as A440, and generally when you hear a piano tuner start, or in fact more importantly when an orchestra, they will be starting with that note. And on that note of the orchestra, it's very interesting. Whenever you hear an orchestra tune up, the oboist, who generally has the cleanest sound, the purest waveform in their sound, the oboe starts, will have decided exactly what note they need. I'll tell you about that now. That A, and then you'll hear the sound. And that's always the sound that you hear when you hear an orchestra tuning up. And the reason is that that is the note A that everyone tunes to. But then as the violins add their open strings, the open strings are tuned to these notes. And then the cellos and the basses add a note C. And so that is the chord that you hear. And what's interesting is that over periods of times, even as the last century or so, most orchestras, including in South Africa, around the world, actually have a slightly raised pitch, and whereas they don't use A at 440 hertz, they usually use A at 441, 442, or 443. And that is a very precise pitch which gives the orchestra or the music a slight brilliance and a slight option. And it's all specified. If you sign up with an orchestra or you go to play with an orchestra, you are specified in your contract that you will play at that pitch. Of course, as a pianist, I never have that problem because there's always a piano waiting for me. But the piano tuner who has tuned the piano will have been given very strict instructions as to exactly what pitch. And I think in KZN, the KZN Philharmonic, I think tuned to about 442 or 443, if I'm not mistaken. Now, what's interesting about that is that all of these factors add together in terms of how notes vibrate and how the notes are sequenced together on the keyboard. Now, Kevin's going to give us this magic view, which is not popular. Apparently, it gives some people a sort of feeling of queasiness or seasick, but it does allow me, just for this evening, to demonstrate to you a few things about how notes work together. So, in terms of pitch and how our notes, how our music works, the most important thing in our music is an octave. And these notes, if you can see on the keyboard, that is A. And you'll see on the piano there are sections here. There are 3 notes, 2 notes, 3 notes, 2 notes, 3 notes, 2 notes, 3 notes, 2 notes. And that is devised and put together like that because it helps us get a very quick and easy glance. Now, if all of these were black notes in between, there and there and there and there, it would just be a complete and continuous range of black and white notes, which would be incredibly difficult to follow. And you wouldn't know where middle C is, but at least when we have 2 and 3, 2 and 3, we know that this is middle C here. It did happen to me once that I sat down at a piano rather quickly. The piano stool was sort of in the wrong place, and I ended up thinking, well, where exactly is middle C? Is it there? I wasn't quite sure. I was a bit confused for a few minutes. Anyway, that is A, and all of these notes, which are there in that section of 3, are all A's. And that is what we call an octave. And it's a very important interval, because from a scientific point of view, in terms of the hertz, if that is 440, that is twice the number. That is 880. And that is half, that's 440, that's 220, that's 110, that's 55, and that's the lowest note on the piano. So there's a very scientific ratio in terms of octaves that the hertz the wavelength is exactly half the length or twice as fast, I think would be the right way to say it. I can prove that to you by this fascinating thing here with the piano. As I've said before, if you play a note, the note on the instrument will stay down until I let go of it. We had come to the pedal. I'm not going to talk about that, but if I push this pedal down, and in fact, you might be able to see, Kevin, can you see in this part of the piano? Can you see my hand here? No, you can't. Okay. We'll go there. That's for another day. Here is the note. And if I push this note down, in other words, I'm releasing the dampers on the notes inside, and I play this note, that is that note, that is that note. If I push that down, releasing the dampers, you can hear the vibration there. In other words, that note is sympathetically vibrating on those strings, which are in a kind of half, the length of the string has a sympathetic vibration, it being half the length, or the other way around. That's that note, that's the top note. There, that's the note, but by playing the lower note, I can make it sound. Etc., etc. You can also do it to a lesser degree with the fifth. But many of the other notes, no response whatsoever. So these notes an octave apart have a sympathetic vibration. They start vibrating because the wavelength is in such close proximity in terms of its wave shape or wave form. I'm not getting the right scientific forms here. Anyway, so the whole point about that is those are all the same notes. The pitch, the wavelength is twice as twice the hertz. And our Western music uses that octave divided into 12 equal notes. Those are 12 equal semitones, or 12 equal divisions. Now, different cultures around the world use different divisions. For instance, Eastern music uses only 5 notes. Or even some African music might use 5 notes. Some Eastern cultures use more than 12, actually some of them, I think Indian culture uses up to 18 or 24 different divisions. So I can't even play those on the piano because they're not actually possible. But how this works is that our octave is divided into 12 equal parts at the moment. And these are them, and as they appear on the keyboard, and these are called semitones, or half tones, you might say. Out of those, in terms of making music, we have scales, and this is a very important part. We have scales where we use 7 of those notes in the scale, and we leave the other 5 out. Now, just reminding you that the arrangement that we have on the keyboard here is just such that the distance, there is no note left out here in between these white notes. Kevin's got the top screen on, I'm sure. The distance between that and that and that and that and that and that is the same. It's just the arrangement on the piano which actually is put together that way to allow us to have a visual glance at it. Now, if I take 7 notes out of that octave, there are 12 possible notes, and I take 7 and I leave 5 out, I can come up with an arrangement like such. I leave 1 out and I create a tone. I leave 1 out and then I don't leave 1 out, so that's a semitone. I leave 1 out, that's a tone. I leave 1 out, that's a tone. I leave 1 out, that's a tone and a semitone. So I'm just playing all the white notes on the keyboard. So I've got tone, tone, semitone, tone, 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 semitone. Okay. Which sounds very familiar. It sounds something like. Of course, is the very famous do idea from The Sound of Music. Now, that just demonstrates that is what we call a scale, and in that particular instance, we have a major scale, which is that arrangement of tone, tone, semitone, tone, 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 semitone. And major scales are very important. In fact, the majority of our Western music is made up of major scales. And so major scales for us entail or signify elements of things like happiness. Or things like very grand moments. Making things up. I'm going to play a lot of messy things tonight. So major happiness, joy, excitement is something that we associate with music in a major key. This brings us to the point that arrangement of notes out of the possible 12 of just repeating tone, tone, semitone, tone, 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 semitone is an arrangement of the sequence of notes that we can actually then start on any key. So for instance, so far I've really been playing in C, the major scale built on the note C. Now I can start that same sequence on the note E, for instance, which is here. Tone, tone, semitone, tone, 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 semitone. So now I have now we're in E major. That's an E major scale, or maybe that's now in F major. So, for instance, I could play. Oopsie. That's in A major. I could play something in G major. I could play something in D flat major. I could play something in D major. Could play something in F major. And that really tells us that the piece of music is built around principally that particular scale, the scale starting on that tone. Now, in fact, I got an email this morning from one of our followers, Jill, who was asking a question about why composers would compose in different keys and what the coloring, what they mean. And apart from the major and minor section, which I'm going to come to you now, it's a little bit more about minor keys, but why use F major or why use E major? It'll be a slightly different color. And I'm not going to go too much into that, but one of the most fascinating things is that they do actually have slightly different feels. For instance, a D major is generally quite a royal march-like key. F major is generally something quite relaxed. What was I going to play? I can't even get that right. Let's go back to what we're doing. A major is quite a bright key. Bit of Mozart there. Each of these keys actually do have a different connotation, and I'm not going to discuss that too much at the moment, but there certainly is an element of how they can work in a favor. What's interesting for me, as I've mentioned before, is that Chopin wrote a lot of music in keys with lots of sharps and flats, because he felt that the natural hand position, if you relax your hand like that, not like that, but like that, your fingers are long. And so he composed music in keys like D flat major or F minor, which have a lot of black notes in it, because your hands, your long fingers, fall very naturally on the black notes, which are raised. They are higher than the white notes. So there's a very much more relaxed feeling, and the way that the hand fits on the keyboard in a very spontaneous element. So when I talk about a piece of music in a major key, that when I say a piece of music isn't, say, for G major, it means that it's literally built predominantly around the scale of G major, or at least it begins and it ends, because we're going to come back to this a little bit later. A piece of music that begins, it's always interesting to see what key it starts in and where it ends. That is the important part, and that gives us an idea of what key the music is really in. The second possibility, then, just to come back to your scales of tone, tone, semitone, tone, 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 semitone, is that we have a different scale that we use a lot in Western music, and that is a minor scale, where a slightly different arrangement. Tone, semitone, tone, tone, semitone, tone and a bit. You call it augmented tone. And that is a minor scale. Now, minor scales and minor keys are things that we generally associate with sadness, melancholy, tragedy. That would be Bach in D minor. How about in E minor? Etc. Chopin in E minor. Piece of music in F minor, more Chopin, a melancholy. Piece of music in G minor. Piece of music in A minor, for instance. Etc., etc. Something we associate with a certain amount of mystery, melancholy, sadness, or tragedy is usually in the minor key. And again, composers would compose according to the particular key or particular vibration that they feel a key might offer to them. So now I don't want to talk too much this evening. I know I'm already talking a lot. I'm going to play for you a complete piece of music. The Prince of Denmark's March. Let's say this, I'm making this up this evening. Prince of Denmark's March by Jeremiah Clarke, which is in D major. key. Let's try some Chopin, a prelude. Short piece of music there, the prelude in C sharp minor by Frédéric Chopin, giving you a sense of tragedy and depth of a minor key. So that's what we come to. Major keys and minor keys can be built around any note of the 12 possible notes of our scale. From C or C sharp, D flat, D or E flat, E, F, etc. And so it can happen with the minor as well. The minor we generally associate with melancholy, sadness and tragedy. In the major key we associate with joy, happiness and exuberance. And that is just to say that the piece of music begins and ends in that key, and that is the predominant home point of it, you might say. All right, so now moving on from the idea of keys and that issue about notes and hertzes and things like that, we're going to go to something a little bit different, and we are going to look at the pulse or the beats of music. Now, the most basic pulse is our heartbeat, and heartbeat is like everything, it beats very regularly, it beats in a very regular cycle, and that gives us a sense of recurrence. We have regularity in many things. In our days, the sun comes up, in our years, in our months, and these repeated cycles are divided into digestible and cognizant points, you might say. And the same is for music, because as much as our heart beats one beat by one beat, it's very useful to divide the music up into patterns of 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. And so from one beat, we'll move on to a 2 beat, which is really very useful, especially when you have 2 legs and 2 arms, because that is when you are marching. So a pattern of music with 2 beats in a bar, for instance, and I'm going to keep talking while I'm playing. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. Etc., etc. 2 beats in a bar, very straightforward. Lovely to have a good march to that. If we add an extra beat to that, we end up with 3 beats in a bar, which of course gives us very famous things like a waltz. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Etc. Or a precursor of the waltz, a minuet. 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 2. Etc., etc. we might have 4 beats in a bar, which is not that dissimilar to 2 beats in a bar. 4 beats in a bar somehow it might just be a broader feeling or a grander stroke. So, for instance, or even a very bold. Moment from Prokofiev's Romeo and Juliet, or 2, 3, 4, etc. Or all very broad pieces which give us 4 beats in a bar. Very nice. 4 is a very rounded, nice number. If we add on 1, we get to a rather unusual figure of 5. And there are not many pieces of music in 5, but there are some. And how it can be divided up, as an example, if you divide 5, or you can't really divide 5 equally, but if you add 3 plus 2, you can get 5. So you can have, for instance, 1 bar of a waltz, 1, 2, 3, plus 1 bar of a march, 1, 2. So 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 2, 3, 1, 2, and you end up with 5. You can change that around, or so there we go. You ever wondered why that piece of music was called Take 5? Well, perhaps that might have some reason to do it. It's written 5 beats in a bar. And it also might explain, if you've ever been at a party dancing and someone puts on Take 5, it's absolutely impossible to dance to because there are 5 beats in a bar. An absolute anomaly. 5 plus 1 equals 6, and 6 is a rather useful number as well because it is divided into 2 groups of 3. So, for instance, instead of having, as I played the minuet, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, that's in 3 groups of 2. If we had 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1. Etc. 6, 8, 2 beats, 2 groups of 3, and very rarely, very seldom 7, 8's not interesting, but if we get to 9, we get 3 groups of 3. So 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Etc., etc. And that's, of course, the very famous Jesu Joy of Man's Desiring. 3 groups of 3, 9, 8 time signature, 9 smaller beats in a bar, you might say. So we discovered the concept of major or minor, which we might call mode. We discovered this. We discussed the sense of pulse, which is how many beats we have in a bar. And the third element we're going to have to that is actually how fast these beats go. For instance, sometimes you can get very fast pieces and sometimes you can get very slow. So you could say that might be pace. We've had mode, pulse, and pace. And so to give you an idea here of some pieces of music, which I can play for you, some things which are very slow, and this is also where the idea of musical Italian names of the speed of a piece of music comes into play. And often pieces of music are known by those Italian names, which are actually really only giving us a sense of how fast they are. So for instance, for very slow, we can have a piece of music which is called Largo, like Handel's Largo, by the composer Handel, but in fact Largo just tells us that the music is slow. So a very slow 3 beats in a bar. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Largo meaning slow. That was the tempo indication to tell the musicians to play this music slowly. Otherwise, they might look at it and play. Which is not very satisfying at all. Another Italian term, adagio, meaning slow. For instance, the pulse of the music, 2 beats in a bar, but adagio meaning expressive and slow. Slightly faster than that, a moderato or a moderate pace, you might say, for instance, in 3 bars. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1. It's a very moderate 3 beats in a bar. Something a little bit faster, you might say an allegro. Lots of allegros around, always. Allegro, what can I play? 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. See? Difficult to talk and play at the same time. Fast being allegro, and very fast, presto or prestissimo, to be as fast as possible. Scarlatti sonata is fast, prestissimo, as fast as possible, or even Flight of the Bumblebee, flapping of wings at a great pace there. So that is the third element that we can talk about a piece of music when we say these Italian terms which are used. If it hasn't been given a specific title, because obviously a lot of music hasn't, it's just a generic title, it might refer to the pace of which it actually takes place. And the last element to listen to, which is much more not discussed, but which are very critical or very crucial part of how the music is constructed or what you might be hearing, is the texture of it. And here, when I'm talking about this, I'm talking about not only referring to not only the fact that the music might have a very clear melody, there might be a very clear melodic line in the music, for instance. As opposed to a piece of music which might not have a clear melody, but might have a more brittle or a more sporadic texture to it. For instance, the other element in terms of what I will often talk about in music, in terms of the descriptions, not only the moods and the motions, but also a kind of physical texture, whether the music like that is spiky. I might describe that as something which is spiky or explosive, as opposed to something which is very smooth. Something which has fluid running lines. Etc. Or something which might be quite bouncy or bubbly. Etc. So all of these elements have the music has a different idea of how clear the melody might be. It might be focused very cleanly around a melody or not. And it also might have a great sense of flowing easiness, smoothness to something very spiky or very brittle. And those elements are very useful to hang on to. Oh, okay. Can be a problem. I've just got a note, a director's note. A director's note appeared around the door. I thought that our load shedding had kicked in. A request for take 5. That is going to be difficult, unfortunately, for copyright reasons, as we've encountered many. I even worry about playing as much as I had, but if I played the entire piece, I think we would be shut down for copyright. But it is a great piece, and I'll see if we can investigate it. Maybe at the end, we'll take a bit of a chance. Where was I before I was interrupted by this? So I think we do need some music at this point, and I am going to play a piece of music which is going to bring all those elements together. For instance, I'm going to play, I don't know. I'm going to play the Beethoven. So Beethoven, Adagio. So we know that Adagio means slow and expressive. We know that the key of the piece of music is an A flat major, and we know that it has 2 beats in the bar. Not that that's particularly important at this point, but these are the elements to listen to. And in fact, the idea to pick up on this and the idea to focus on this is to actually I would say this piece of music, it is slow and expressive with a broadly spanned or broadly shaped melody. So. to commit terrible, sacrilegious idea and not complete the piece of music and end there, but I am worried about our time, and I would like to try and finish all the simpler ideas that we are going to talk about, just briefly about how all of this fits together and why we are including all of these things. One of the ideas that I keep repeating and I keep talking about with the music is I talk about opus numbers and identification numbers. Now, this is interesting. Opus refers to work. It's an Italian name that refers to the operatic conception, because in the beginning of music, sort of I think 15th, 16th century, work of music was generally an opera, and so the opus name remained as a complete composition. One of the first composers to really publish their works and use this opus title as in terms of publishing their compositions and saying, this is my opus, this is the composition that I'm publishing and putting out to the world in a complete way, was in fact Beethoven. Mozart published a substantial amount of music. For instance, he composed a set of 3 sonatas. I played one of them recently. That's the Sonata K311. Come back to that in a second. He composed 3 sonatas and published them as his Opus 4. But that was the 311th work that he had written. And this was then causing a bit of a problem, because what you published and what you wrote was not always fitting together. Beethoven, as I say, was really the first person to publish under opus numbers the majority of his work. So in fact, the first composition he published is an Opus 1, which are 3 separate pieces of music for trio, violoncello, piano, his Opus 1. And I think the last compositions he published were Opus 133, that nature, the Grosse Fuge. 133, I think, is the last one, 135. The reason why these numbers are useful and are very important, and a lot of the information that I'm giving to you about keys as well, is that it's very important for us to be able to identify the exact work. So for instance, if I say I am going to play the sonata number 14, Opus 27, number 2 in C sharp minor, there's a lot of information there. But it does tell us that out of the 32 piano sonatas that Beethoven wrote, this is the 14th of them. And Opus 27, this is the 27th work that he published. And Opus 27 number 2, here were 2 sonatas, Opus 27 number 1 and 27 number 2. And 27 number 1, I'm actually playing on Saturday evening, sounds like this. Opus 27, that's Sonata number 13, Opus 27 number 1. Sonata number 14, Opus 27 number 2, sounds. Etc., the very popular Moonlight Sonata. And so it means that when I talk about, or when anyone talks about these pieces of music, that you as an audience or that anyone else can go and actually identify them. Because if I just said the Piano Sonata now by Beethoven, it could be any one of the 32. If I said that it was a piano sonata in C minor, Beethoven wrote 2 piano sonatas in C minor. Chopin wrote a number of nocturnes. He wrote 17 nocturnes. If I didn't give you an idea of which one it was, I might say it's a nocturne in E flat, but there are two nocturnes, or sometimes there might be 3 in a particular key. So it's very difficult to know exactly what it is. But if I say it's the Chopin nocturne Opus 9 number 2 in E flat, there's a very clear identification which allows anyone listening to that to go and find the music, research the music, and know exactly which piece if we're playing on a program. And that's why it's very important historically when composers or pianists started actually including these details on their programs. It was very useful for us to know exactly which pieces of music they were playing. at some point, many composers or many pianists would just say a Chopin nocturne in E flat, and then we don't know which one was actually being played. Now, as I mentioned, composers like Mozart, and to some extent Schubert, contemporary roughly around the same time of Beethoven, did not publish all their works for various reasons. Not everything was published. And so with Mozart's works, there's a cataloging using the K number, which comes from a Mr. Köchel, who identified from various sources the catalog that Mozart himself kept. He wrote down the first 2 or 3 lines of each piece of music, just to try and keep track of them. There are over 622 of them. And also, according to the letters, he would write about a particular piece of music from a letter dated in Salzburg in 1786 or something like that, and would describe a piece of music for string quartet in E flat, and then we would know. And also by the paper marks on the music in which it is written, and from the paper mark, the manufacturer, about which city or which manufacturer of the paper, musicians or musicologists would be able to identify where Mozart was at any particular point in time, hopefully. And so those catalogs, the K number refers to the catalog, the number of the work itself, K1 being the very first minuet. And K620 something, the Requiem, the last work that he actually didn't complete, but that he wrote. The other composer which uses a number like that is Schubert, whose numbers are often followed by sometimes opus numbers, but usually also by a number D, which refers to a musicologist by the name of Mr. Deutsch, who catalogued Schubert's compositions also by chronological order. And the other composer, sometimes with Bach, because there's very few compositions actually of Bach in his time, well, not that many were published. And in fact, apparently when Bach's music was rediscovered by Mendelssohn in Leipzig in the mid-19th century, and there was this great music revival, that's where the Bach revival, should I say, not a music revival, that's something else. A Bach revival in the mid-19th century, Bach's manuscripts apparently were being used sometimes as scrap paper. Mendelssohn, the story I heard rather charmingly, Mendelssohn actually found he had bought fish and chips apparently from a cellar or a fast food market of some sort, and it was actually wrapped in a piece of waste paper which turned out to be an original Bach manuscript. In other words, the only original surviving version of Bach's original handwriting, which means that one wonders how many pieces of music of Bach that he wrote actually were lost. And Bach uses a different cataloging system, a BWV system, which is not chronologically ordered, but organized by the types of works that he wrote together. So through all of this, it helps, as I'm telling you all of this, when I say that I'm going to play a Chopin nocturne, for instance, in E flat major, opus 9, number 2, which is... Or I'm going to play a Mozart Fantasy in C minor, K475. Or a Beethoven Sonata in C major, opus 53. Rachmaninoff Prelude, for instance, in G minor, opus 23, number 5. All of these works have catalog numbers, opus numbers, and keys, and it does help us identify them and tell us a little bit, and the audience, about the music and what it entails. And I hope all of that information is going to be useful to you. Now, the last issues that I would like to just discuss briefly are beginning to then show you about how a piece of music is organized and how a composer can extend a piece of music beyond just a few bars and beyond an opening key, an opening scale. Because if we play, for instance, to that point, that's a piece of music by Mozart, K545, Köchel 545. It's the Allegro, the first movement from the Sonata K545 in C major. But up to that point, it was all in the key of C major. There was not one note that did not belong to the C major scale. And so what I'm going to tell you about just briefly is the idea of this sense of how music can then migrate. There's a kind of a migration. If you have a home key, which is your opening key, and your closing key, composers then create a sense of migration, that place of stability and that sense of home is then challenged or then moved slightly. You might migrate to a neighboring country, a key which shares many of the same notes but might have one or two different. For instance, is the key of C major, the scale of C major. That is a closely related key of G major, and there's only one note different in that sequence of notes. And by including that, including what we call a modulation, it means that composers can then move from one key fractionally to another key. It's like going from here to Namibia or Zimbabwe, Angola, and then coming back home. You'll come back for the end of the piece. You're not going to stay there permanently. And that sort of challenge, or that sort of maneuvering around from one home to another. Speaking of homes, we should all be sitting at home and not maneuvering around in this state of lockdown and isolation. But that's how music is created in terms of the contrast and in terms of extending a piece of music like that. And I'm going to demonstrate this to you with a composition, for instance, by the Italian Baroque composer Domenico Scarlatti, and show you how this works. He starts off. Okay, so first of all, this is a sonata in F minor. Scarlatti also has a K number, but the K standing for Kirkpatrick. And I'm not sure, I actually should know, but I actually don't know which number that is. I haven't seen the music for a very long time. But this is how he starts off. This is now in A flat, B flat minor, C, point he arrives very clearly in C major with a very different musical idea. And I say very different, it's actually not really that different, but in the context it is. It's a different, this is your opening. And the second bit, which is in a different key because he's modulated. He's now found himself. Halfway through the piece, there is a pause, and I will then repeat it. It's not written out, but I will play the repeat. I will repeat it again from beginning to end. In the second half of the piece, G major, G, C. Now he's back to F, and that's what you had previously. That idea which you had in C major is now in F major. But no, look at it. He's just changed the minor into the major, which is just a thing that Baroque composers did sometimes. But you have this transposition. What the material that you heard halfway through in one key is now repeated in the home key. So listen to that again. The beginning. Halfway through. And going to stop, repeat the second part. He starts the second half where he finished, and then the piece ends with the second part of the material now in the home key. So that is giving you an idea of how he starts in one key, migrates to another key, has a related but different musical idea, has a little break, starts in that key, and then returns back to the home key, repeating the second idea, but in the home key, a transposition. So this is the sonata in F minor by Scarlatti. That was a mess. Let me try again. Sonata by Scarlatti, and I've actually played through the piece there twice. I played the first half and repeated it, and the second half and repeated it. The composer would just write the two little dots at the end to signify that it was custom to repeat it. Sometimes I might only repeat one half, but the correct way, as I did it, would be to actually repeat both parts of it. Now the last little issue, there's a whole other episode that could be discussed around the form and structure of pieces, which I'm going to keep for another time. And I see we are running after 7, so the last thing I'm going to ask Kevin to bring up a little graphic that I put together, which is going to give to you just an overview of how, and I'm talking largely, I'm talking only about the composers that I play generally, because I'm generally talking about the same people, Bach, Handel, and Scarlatti that we start with, as I said, all born in the year of 1685. Those are what we might call 17th century or Baroque composers, like I've just played. Lots of notes, very frivolous. The word Baroque actually means, this comes from a Spanish, Portuguese term at least, for grotesque or overly wrought. So very ornate, lots of notes, lots of finicky work. etc., etc. Not to say that didn't have melodies as well and slower moments, but a lot of notes in the music. The second group of composers we generally refer to then as composers like Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven, who form later 18th century music, classical period, you might say, a more restrained balance between lyricism and this busyness, a sort of effervescence in the music often. Everything about restrained lightness and naturalness, how completely natural and human in a very balanced, sensible way we all are. Composers such as Chopin, Liszt, Schumann, etc., all born amazingly around a very unique date of approximately 1810, 1811. And these are what we would call romantic or 19th century composers, where as opposed to that balance and the nice, predictable ways of human nature that we saw in Mozart, Haydn, and Beethoven, these composers would now be exploring things which are unpredictable and magical, things which are extreme. So the virtuosity, the extreme virtuosity of Liszt, the melancholy of Chopin, the beautiful lyricism of Schubert and his magical ways that he writes music. And really exploring a sense that music is beyond the reality of where we are. And then the last group of composers, and again, I'm only really dealing with the composers that I play in this graphic here, are Debussy, Ravel, Rachmaninoff, and I've also included, just out of interest, Scott Joplin and George Gershwin. And this is moving towards a new style of music. For instance, Debussy using different sounds. Still quite romantic, for instance, but very unique scales. A very different and ethereal way of writing the music, using beautiful chords in Ravel's music. Or in the extreme virtuosity, for instance, of Rachmaninoff. Something what you try and play and talk at the same time. And of course Gershwin, with his very unique character of combining classical and jazz sounds together. Etc., etc. And one of the things which I find quite unique about composers, whenever I talk about the composer's life and the possibilities of how they composed and how they lived, everyone seems to be all very intrigued about how long they lived for. And so I've actually made up a list here. For instance, Bach was 65 years old, Handel 74, Scarlatti 72, Mozart a mere 35 years old when he died. Beethoven 57, Schubert only 31, Chopin 39, Liszt 75, and Gershwin 41, a 41-year-old Gershwin. Incredible that he managed to write all that music in such a short and very eventful time. Of course, I did get myself into rather hot water about this once, because I mentioned the fact that Beethoven, someone asked me, they said, well, how old was Beethoven when he died? And I said, well, he was 57. He was actually quite oldish, older person. And everyone looked at me very, very startled, and I realized that, in fact, everyone sitting in the room was probably well into their 70s. And I was like, well, this is relative when you have to look at Gershwin or Mozart or Schubert at the time. Beethoven actually was 57. Amazingly enough, I didn't just realize that. Liszt was 75. What an incredible life. Amazing life that Franz Liszt lived and composed. Very interesting story there. So I hope all of that gives you a sense of how these composers fit together. Obviously, there's a whole lot more to explore. It's amazing what one can find on YouTube and also on the internet. But I hope through this session, which has been a little bit different to what I normally present, that it's given you a sense of the understanding, as I said in the beginning, of what I'm talking about when I talk about the composers that I'm playing, uses the terminology of opus and keys and nocturnes and sonata, etc., that generally I'm talking about in the pieces that I play in these live sessions, how that will all fit together. I had a request earlier for Take 5 as created by the Dave Brubeck Quartet, and I'm going to give that a go. So let's see if Facebook or copyright shuts us down. This will be the end of our stream. Thank you for joining me this evening. Here's a little moment of Take 5 for you. Take 5 there from the Dave Brubeck Quartet. I hope to be able to bring you a fascinating story about that one day. Bringing to an end this evening's piano hour. Well, it's been an hour and a half now. It's 7:15 already, at 7:15. And this is Christopher Daigan signing out. Thanks to Kevin Liddell for the technical support. Thank you for all of you for watching and for all of you who've supported financially. If you are enjoying this production and you would like to buy a ticket or able to support us, please do so. If you're not able to, that's also absolutely fine. We understand that many people like myself are in a very difficult situation with income at the moment, and it's really about the possibility of sharing the music and enjoying something together in the community around these live stream sessions. So I look forward to seeing you on Saturday. I'll be playing in concert with a beautiful program of music by Beethoven, his Sonata, Opus 27, number 1 in E flat, and as well as a selection of waltzes and music by Claude Debussy. We look forward to seeing you there just before 6 o'clock on Saturday. I'll obviously start the program at 6. We hope this evening's stream, graphics and very interesting camera angles here have been enjoyable and have given you an opportunity to enjoy this hour with us. Have a good evening, stay well, and look after yourself.